Here we go. Brianna Ross is joining us from Baltimore, where she is a social studies department chair. Brianna, if you could unmute, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Melanie. First of all, good evening, everyone. I am so excited to be here, and then Melanie asked me to be a part of this forum, to be a part of this dialogue. I am amazed that someone wants to hear my perspective, so I'm so excited today to share it. So a couple weeks ago, Melanie and I were talking about what this week's spotlight would look like. What would the conversation be? And we know that we are deep in Black History Month, my favorite time of the year. And so we started discussing literature, and this brought some real joy to me, and to me. I'm a social studies teacher now, but I was a former language arts teacher, and I have a real love for books. So when Nalini and I started talking about literature, it really brought me back to one of my early literary experiences. My mom and I love to read. We are avid readers. So we grew up, or I grew up, and we went to the library. Going to the library was like going to Disney World for me. That was like, there is nothing better than going to the library and picking out a book. And one of my favorite books, if you are familiar, is Corduroy. And I hope we're familiar because this is classic literature, right? And so the first thing that comes to my mind is like this beautiful red cover with Corduroy the bear and these green jumpers. But if you're not familiar with this story, I'll just give you a little background. So Corduroy is a bear in a department store, and this little girl and her mom, Lisa, and her mom go into the department store, and Lisa sees Corduroy. And she's like, Mom, I want to buy him. And her mom is like, nah, he's missing a button. He's not really put together. And so they leave. And so Corduroy is distraught, like, oh my God, didn't know I was missing a button. Like, I need to go figure this out. So Corduroy that night, when the department store closes, he wanders around the store and he's looking for this missing button so that someone can buy him, right? So that someone can love him. And so this is where we get that classic image of Corduroy in the department store trying to pull the button off the mattress, if you're familiar with the story. And a security guard finds Corduroy, he picks them up, he takes them back, puts them back on the shelf, like, you're not supposed to be here. And then the next day, Lisa comes in, she buys Corduroy. She's like, I saved enough money to buy you. She buys Corduroy and she goes home. And they live happily ever after. And that's the story. It's really innocuous. There's nothing really particular. There's nothing particularly interesting that happens. There's nothing really significant about the story, but it is my absolute favorite story. It was the book that I wanted my mom to check out for me all the time. And when I went to college, I minored in children's literature. And so one of our assignments was to think really critically about our favorite book. And so I go to the library and check out Corduroy, and I'm having this really visceral and nostalgic experience of turning the pages and reading this book again. And it's not till I get to the end that I process for the first time ever that Lisa, who is a really ancillary character in the story, doesn't have much to do in the story. The story is really about Corduroy, but Lisa was a little Black girl. And this was really significant because this book was written in the 60s. Also, just the context of the book, they're in a department store, which we know the emergence of department stores in the 50s and 60s was really a space for the middle and upper class, right? So Lisa goes into this department store. She's wearing gloves. Her and her mother both have like wraps on their heads. She goes home to this room that's her own. And I don't think I had ever seen Black girls in books before. I had never seen Black characters, especially in a book like this, where the story was not about her. It wasn't about her Blackness. It wasn't about her culture. It wasn't about her food, her traditions. It certainly wasn't a story of struggle. The story was really about Corduroy. But I think in seeing that book, it was one of my favorites because I related to her. She was a character I could identify with. I grew up in a middle-class home. I had my own bedroom. I had a teddy bear that looked very much like Corduroy, right? And so in thinking about this, and I was so glad Nalini asked me to talk about literature because it was the first thing that came to my mind. It made me sort of think, how are we being represented in the literature? And so Black History Month becomes this time, right, where we all sit down and we start to think, like, let's pull out, it's February now, y'all, let's pull out the books, right? Let's pull out the authors. Let's pull out the Maya Angelou's. Let's pull out the Nikki Giovanni's. Maybe if we're really cultured, maybe we'll pull out a James Baldwin, who happens to be one of my favorites. We start pulling them off the shelves and we start dusting them off. And this is the month we want to take an appreciation for those authors. But this year the last 12 months have been really interesting. We've been living amidst multiple pandemics, a global health pandemic and a racial pandemic. And I think this year has really exposed so much for us in terms of police brutality, the massive inequities due to COVID, just these systems of oppression that are continuing to work or at work in our society. And so this year has been, I think, a real awakening. It's been an opening of eyes for people. And so one of the things that happened for me in particular right after the murder of George Floyd, that was when everybody was like, oh no, there's a problem. Now, I can say that as a Black woman who lives in Black skin every day in this country, I always knew there was a problem, right? But I was appreciative for the space that people felt like they needed to enter in to now have a sort of a reckoning and an understanding of the experiences of Black men and women in this country. And so when George Floyd was murdered in particular, I started to see my feeds, my Facebook feed, my Twitter feed, my Instagram feed. All my feeds were being flooded with one, the realization of the oppression that we experience in this country and part of what the Black experience is. But then it also became, here are the resources, right? If you want to be an ally, here are the resources. If you want to know how to better support the Black community, here are the resources. Here are the podcasts you should listen to. Here are the books we should read. Here's how we work towards anti-racism. Here are the Black authors. Here's why Black Lives Matter is important. And it all really comes down to like, how do we fix this, right? How do we fix this issue that we're having in our country? Because we're having really some issues in our country. And so then I start seeing people now, we're reading Dr. Bettina Love, and we're starting to read Isabel Wilkerson, and we're starting to read Ibram Kendi. And so there's a part of me that in this last year has been so overwhelmingly excited. Like, look at what this has exposed. It's unfortunate that it took so much, right? It took the murders of Black men and women on camera, which has happened before, but it took this time when we were really still and really sitting in this pandemic to realize this. But it also has made I have to be honest that it's also a little bit triggering for me, because right now all of a sudden it feels like 2020 came and we're now in 2021, and we've been in this fight and this battle towards racial and both social justice in this country. But it is also an experience that is true to what it means to be a Black man or woman in this country. But the other side of that has also been a struggle for me is that pain is not our only experience, and our narratives are so much more nuanced and so much greater than that. And I think that is what the 5-year-old me understood in reading Corduroy with the little Black girl at a department store just shopping with her mother. I think I was aware of the fact that is not our only experience, especially because that was one of the only books I had growing up where I saw anybody who looked like me, where there was anyone whose experience really mirrored mine. And I by no means want to diminish the incredible work and writing of these authors, of our Ibram Kendis, of our Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? I certainly don't want to diminish them. And I certainly don't want to encourage anyone to stop reading those books, because those books are important, especially right now. We want to continue forums like this, and conversation like this is where this work happens and where it takes place. And we have to be able to do that. But I also want to be aware of the fact that this is not our only story. And it also makes me think about, what does this do to our collective psyche as a country, as people of color, and certainly as a Black people? And this becomes really significant in particular for me because I am a teacher. So a few years ago when I was teaching elementary school, I got to do this awesome unit with my kids on historical fiction, which probably should have been my key, that I should have been a history teacher to begin with. But I got to do this awesome unit on historical fiction with my students. And I was reading this book with a group of students called The Songs of Stones River. And it was about the Civil War. And it was written from two perspectives. It was two competing narratives. It was the narrative of a young, about 11-year-old Black boy and an 11-year-old white boy, both who are living during the Civil War. The white boy ends up going and fighting. They become friends, but the white boy, his father is an army, he's a soldier for the Confederate Army. And so the story is about them trying to understand the racial dynamics of their friendship and of the country at the time. So what's interesting about the story, it's told in these two perspectives. And so the chapters flip back and forth between the two main characters. But what's interesting is it's not explicit about who the characters necessarily are. And for my 5th graders reading this book, we really had to dig into the context clues to figure out who is who. And so when we're sitting having a conversation around this book one day, the story is being told from the perspective of the young white boy. And he says how his father is a soldier in the Confederate Army. And my students immediately are like, wait, Ms. Ross, I thought James was the Black one. And I'm like, well, why did you think that? He's like, wait, this is the white character? And I'm like, yeah, this is the white character. And they're like, but I thought he was the other one. And I'm like, well, tell me why. And they're like, well, because, he lives with his mom. His dad is dead, and he lives with a single mom, and they're poor. And he kind of like talks. He doesn't have really great language. He kind of talks bad. And I'm like, so those are the reasons why they felt like that character was the Black character. And let me also give a little bit of context. I'm sitting at a table with 8 Black students, and they're telling me this, we thought this character was Black because he speaks bad English, and because he has a single mother, and because they're really poor and they're struggling. And so he has to work because he needs to help his family. And those are all the reasons why he thought that he was Black. And I'm sitting with them like, but what does that mean about us? Right? If this is our narrative about who Black people are, what does that say about us? Do we speak poor English? We don't, right? Are we in these positions of struggle? We're not. And so it was this real reckoning for me that this is the language and these are the stories that even we tell about ourselves as Black men and women, and certainly for our Black children. These are the stories that we tell. We tell stories about ourselves that look like struggle. Those are the experiences they're used to. So it was so unfathomable for my students to conceptualize that the white character was the character who struggled in the story. They had no other context about who Black people were, who Black people were being represented as, even though they were sitting in this room in their skin with Black teachers and other Black students, knowing Black people. And this was their concept. And so that really put me in a space of there's something, we need to move towards something else. And we really need to start thinking critically about what kinds of literature, what kinds of movies, what kinds of media, what kinds of art that we are consuming. And it just felt so personal to me, because we are raising these Black children in this world where they are not seeing themselves in anything, in any other narrative but struggle. And even now, when we go to pick up our books, right, when we're in Black History Month and someone asks you what books you're reading, right, if you think about what those books are, what kinds of, what story is being told about Black people? Is it a story about, is it a history of racism? Is it about oppression? Is it about the police, the prison industrial complex? What are the stories that we're telling about ourselves? And how do we shift that? And so I think my call to action for us today is to consider that, consider what lens we take when we approach the kinds of literature that we consume. Something that was really interesting, and thinking in this idea of a monolith, something that's interesting, that as I was just kind of doing a little background digging in preparation for this. So I started to think, well, let me just go look and see who some Black authors are. And so if any of us right now were to go to Google and we were to look for some of our Black authors, the first ones that we see are Toni Morrison, Ta-Nehisi Coates, James Baldwin, and Octavia Butler, who are all very different authors. And so I was like, okay, that's what we get. These are wonderful people, writers and authors who I happen to really love. And so I was like, well, let me look at the opposite and let me go Google white authors. And when you Google white authors, you don't get any of that. You get articles about white people writing Black characters. You get articles about white people tapping into some critical consciousness. So in my head, I'm like, did I do it? Maybe I need to say Caucasian. Let me try Caucasian authors. Maybe I'll pull something up there. And I try that and I get nothing. And so I'm like, okay, so let me try something else. Let me try white poets. And I still get nothing. And let me try white fiction. And I still get nothing. So I'm like, let me just try fiction authors. Maybe I'll pull up something there. And when you pull up fiction authors, immediately you get Margaret Atwood, you get J.K. Rowling, you immediately get this list of authors, not a Toni Morrison, not a James Baldwin. None of those people fit into those categories. And it also just made me think about how we consider our Black writers, right? Black writers they're not all under this one umbrella. Octavia Spencer was the science fiction author. James Baldwin is an essayist. Ta-Nehisi Coates kind of fits in both. He floats around both, right? How are we considering our Black authors and the people and the narratives that we're consuming? And so my call to action for us today is not to stop reading those books, right? Between the World and Me is excellent. The New Jim Crow is an excellent book. By no means should we stop working and fighting and moving towards racial justice. But I think we also need to think about the fact that Black readers and non-Black people need to see ourselves in a narrative that exists outside of struggle, outside of slavery, outside of racism, outside of police brutality. We are so much more than that. Black people like to go on adventures. Black people fall in love. Black people enjoy fantasy and want to see themselves represented in that. We are so much more than this monolith that we have created for who Black men and women are and the stories that we tell about them. And so I think when we move into our breakout rooms today, when we think about the conversation, we want to think about where are the books that are going to show our humanity, right? And I think if we really want to move to connect these dots, right, between systemic oppression, if we're trying to move from systemic oppression to a world that looks more racially just, this is how we connect those dots. We find those books that show our humanity, that we are a people who are in need of connection, that we have depth and character, and we experience the same range of human emotions that everybody else does, regardless of the race. And so that is sort of my call to action for us today. As you move into your breakout rooms, the conversation that we're going to have is first, just what is your first introduction to a Black story? And that doesn't have to be a book, whether it's the neighbor across the street, whether it's a story, a song, a poet, a movie. What was your first introduction to Black stories? And then think about place yourself in the context of now. What is your exposure to Black stories since then? And if you're reflecting back on your understanding, how familiar would you consider yourself? What stories do you know? What do you know about what the Black experience is? And has it been limited to stories of struggle, stories of oppression? Stories of pain. So that's the first question we kind of want you guys to reflect on. The second piece of that is, what's one way that you have been awakened to exercise a critical lens into how you consume media? And that media can be books, podcasts, film, TV, whatever that media is. How can we apply a critical lens? How can we call ourselves inward to be reflective about what it is that we're consuming and experiencing? How can we expose ourselves to a much broader narrative that may not necessarily be as easily accessible as the J.K. Rowling or as the Margaret Atwood? So that's going to be the work that we do as we move into these breakout sessions.